All right, ready to dive in? Today we're tackling something that's been a real puzzle for philosophers. Multiple realizability.
Yeah, it's one of those concepts that really makes you question some basic assumptions.
As a philosopher, you're already thinking about mind and body, right? And this concept goes right to the core of that.
Absolutely. It gets to the heart of what consciousness even is.
We're basing this deep dive on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on multiple realizability, so we're going pretty deep with this one.
Excellent source. Lots to unpack there.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Multiple realizability, in a nutshell, is the idea that the same mental state, like feeling pain, could be realized by many different physical states.
Right. It challenges the idea that there's a one-to-one mapping between mental states and brain states.
And that has huge implications for how we understand the mind.
For sure. I mean, think about it. Could an octopus feel pain the same way we do, even though their brain is completely different from ours?
Whoa, an octopus feeling pain. That's a wild thought. But it gets to the heart of the issue, doesn't it?
It does, because if pain is just a specific brain state, how could such different brains have the same experience?
Okay, so let's bring in some philosophical heavyweights here. We've got mind-brain identity theory, the classic view that mental states are identical to specific brain states.
Right, the idea that each type of mental state corresponds to a particular brain state.
But then along comes Hilary Putnam, back in 1967, and he throws a wrench in the works with his argument against mind-brain identity theory.
Yeah, Putnam's argument really shook things up. He used pain as a key example.
Like, how can we say pain is a specific brain state when so many different creatures seem to experience it?
Exactly. He pointed out the incredible diversity of creatures who seem to feel pain: mammals, birds, even cephalopods like the octopus.
Hold on, are we talking octopus philosophers now?
Ha! Maybe someday. But the point is, if pain is just a specific brain state, how could such vastly different brains produce the same mental experience?
So Putnam is basically saying that the diversity of brains experiencing pain challenges the idea that pain is tied to one specific brain state.
Right, and that opened the door to functionalism, which says maybe it's not about the physical stuff, but the role a mental state plays in a system.
So functionalism shifts the focus from what the brain is made of to what it does. Kind of like saying a heart can be made of muscle or some futuristic biotech as long as it pumps blood, right?
A perfect analogy. It's about the function, not the physical makeup.
But wait, even functionalism seems to run into trouble with more radical versions of multiple realizability.
Right, things get really tricky when you consider a system that might achieve the same mental state through completely different processes.
Like, is that even multiple realizability anymore? Where do we draw the line?
That's a question that has kept philosophers debating for decades, and it leads to some really fundamental questions about consciousness and scientific explanation.
Okay, so we've got the theoretical groundwork laid out. But how does all of this play out in actual scientific research? I know our source material mentions examples from neuroscience, like the work of Bechtel and Mundell.
Right, they make a really interesting point about brain mapping studies.
Yeah, if brains are so different across species, how can we learn anything about human vision by studying monkey brains?
Exactly. If seeing in a human has a totally different neural basis than seeing in a monkey, how do those studies even work?
But they do work, and they rely on these cross-species comparisons. So does that mean multiple realizability is wrong?
Not necessarily. Kara Figdor brings in another concept here: degeneracy in neuroscience.
Degeneracy. That sounds kind of bad.
Haha, not in this case. It just means there are multiple ways for the brain to achieve the same goal. Think of it like multiple paths leading to the same destination.
Okay, so there might be some underlying similarities in brain function, but there's still flexibility in the specific neural mechanisms involved.
Precisely. And this brings us back to a fundamental question. How do we even define mental states in the first place?
Oh, good point. If we can't even pin down what a mental state is, how can we talk about it being realized in different ways?
Exactly. And this is where Shapiro's dilemma comes in. He uses a really interesting analogy with corkscrews to illustrate this.
Welcome back. Last time we were wrestling with Shapiro's dilemma, trying to figure out how we even define mental states in the first place. Did we make any progress on that?
Well, Shapiro uses this really clever analogy involving corkscrews to illustrate the problem. Imagine two corkscrews, one's red, one's blue. They both do the same thing, open wine bottles, but they differ in color. Are those really different realizations of the corkscrew concept?
I see what you mean. If we say any difference at all means it's a different realization, then multiple realizability becomes kind of trivial, right?
Right. It's like every corkscrew is unique in some way, but they're still all corkscrews. So where do we draw the line? What makes two physical systems different enough to count as different realizations of the same mental state?
Okay, so the definition of different is key here, but that just seems to make this whole debate even more complicated.
It does, and it gets even trickier because some philosophers argue that multiple realizability actually supports reductionism, not what you'd you'd expect, right?
Hold on, reductionism. Isn't that the view that everything could be reduced to brain states?
Well, reductionism comes in different flavors. Elliot Sober, for instance, argues that multiple realizability actually points to the explanatory power of physics.
Physics. We're going even deeper than brains now.
Exactly. Sober's point is that even with multiple realizations at high levels, it all traces back to fundamental physical processes.
So, like, various contractions can trap a mouse, but ultimately they all obey the laws of physics.
Precisely. Sober argues that physics is the foundation for understanding causation.
But wait, if physics is king, doesn't that make psychology kind of irrelevant?
That's a common concern. But remember, science aims for both breadth and depth of explanation. Physics might explain the how, but psychology explores the why. We need both.
Okay, so physics might be the foundation, but psychology still has its own role to play. It's like appreciating a symphony. Yes, it's just vibrations in the air, but that doesn't diminish the beauty and complexity of the music.
Great analogy. Now, while Sober is advocating for a zoomed-out, physics-based reductionism, John Bickel goes in the opposite direction, zooming in to the molecular level of the brain. He calls it ruthless reductionism.
Ruthless. Sounds a bit intense.
Bickel argues that while brains seem different across species at the systems level, a really interesting pattern emerges when you zoom into the level of cells and molecules. He uses the example of memory consolidation, the process of making memories last.
Ah, the process that's hopefully ensuring I remember this deep dive.
Exactly. And research shows that the same molecular pathway for memory consolidation exists in creatures as different as flies, slugs, and mice.
Whoa, so my brain, a slug's brain, and a fly's brain all use the same molecular machinery to form memories. That's wild.
It really highlights how some survival mechanisms are so crucial that they've stayed remarkably stable across vast evolutionary distances.
So even though our brains look totally different on the surface, there's this deeper level of unity at play. Like, different cars might have different designs, but they all rely on the same principles of internal combustion.
Perfect analogy. Bickel suggests that as we explore molecular and cellular cognition, we'll find more of these ruthlessly reduced mechanisms shared across species. It's almost like there's a molecular blueprint for consciousness itself, despite the incredible diversity of life.
But isn't that a bit of a leap? Just because we find some shared mechanisms, does that mean all mental states are ruthlessly reduced?
You raise a good point. It's still very much up for debate how far this reductionist approach can go. And it leads us to another crucial aspect of this whole multiple realizability debate, defining what actually counts as genuine multiple realizability. This is where philosophers Thomas Polger and Lawrence Shapiro enter the picture.
Okay, Polger and Shapiro. What's their take on all this?
They offer what they call an official recipe for identifying true multiple realizability, and a key ingredient is the concept of relevance.
Relevant. So how does this official recipe work?
It's about connecting the differences in physical systems to the function being performed. For instance, with pain, the differences between a human brain and an octopus brain have to be relevant to the experience of pain, not just some random difference in wiring.
So it's not enough to just point out that brains are different. We need to show how those differences actually impact the mental state in question.
Exactly. But this raises another tricky question. How much should we defer to scientists when judging relevance? Can philosophy provide its OWN criteria, or do we ultimately need empirical evidence?
Feels like we're right back to the mind-body problem. Can philosophy alone define the mind? Or do we need science to ground our understanding? This deep dive is getting pretty meta.
It is, and it gets even more complex because Polder and Shapiro argue that even if multiple realizability is true in some cases, it doesn't automatically rule out mind-brain identities.
Wait, so we could have both mind-brain identity and multiple realizability. Now that's a plot twist. Tell me more.
It does seem paradoxical, but their view, which they call modest identity theory, suggests it's possible.
Okay, so last time we were left hanging with this idea of modest identity theory. How can we have both mind-brain identity and multiple realizability?
Right. It seems like you'd have to choose one or the other. But Polger and Shapiro argue it's not about denying the variety of ways mental states can be physically realized.
So it's not like saying, okay, multiple realizability wins, mind-brain identity is out the window.
Exactly. They're saying it's more about recognizing that mental states are still fundamentally grounded in the brain.
So it's like acknowledging that houses can be built with different materials, bricks, wood, even straw, but they're all still houses.
Perfect analogy. They argue that these identities between mental states and brain states are actually crucial for scientific explanation, even with multiple realizability.
So it's not about rejecting multiple realizations, but acknowledging that identifying mental states with brain states still has a lot of explanatory power. Kind of like, yeah, different engines exist, but they're all still operating on the same basic principles of thermodynamics.
Exactly. They see this modest identity theory as the most balanced approach for understanding the relationship between psychology and neuroscience.
And they address some common worries about this view, right? Like, doesn't this just eliminate the need for psychology altogether?
Yeah, some critics think that if mental states are just brain states, we should just ditch psychology and focus on neuroscience. But Polger and Shapiro argue that's not the case at all.
So they're not saying mental states don't exist, just that they're grounded in brain states.
Right, they see value in both fields. Psychology still has a role to play, even with these underlying identities.
Okay, so it's not about one science replacing the other, more like different levels of explanation working together.
Exactly. They believe psychologists can still talk about mental causes, even if those causes are rooted in neural processes. They even use an interventionist account of causation, a popular idea in the philosophy of science, to defend a kind of autonomy for psychology.
So even though mental states might be identical to brain states, there's still a distinct realm of psychological explanation that's valuable. We need both the physical and the experiential to really grasp what's going on. It's like reducing a symphony to vibrations. It doesn't make the music disappear, right?
Exactly, we need both perspectives. And that brings us to a key takeaway from our deep dive into multiple realizability. It's a complex issue. There are no easy answers.
Right. It's not a simple case of right or wrong. More about appreciating the nuances, the different perspectives, and recognizing the limits of any single view.
Which is, as you know, a pretty core skill for any philosopher.
Absolutely. And like any good deep dive, we end up with more questions than answers.
For sure. If even basic mental states like pain can be realized in such wildly different ways, what does that say about the uniqueness of human consciousness? Does the specific structure of our brain matter after all? Could we someday create artificial minds that are genuinely conscious, even if their physical structure is completely different from ours?
Now, those are questions to ponder. Questions that will likely keep philosophers busy for a long time to come.
Maybe even octopus philosophers someday. Who knows?
Maybe. But for you, our listener, this deep dive is just the starting point. The world of multiple realizability, with all its complexities and challenges, is out there for you to explore.
So keep questioning, keep digging, and see where it leads you. You might even end up questioning the very nature of reality itself.
And that's what philosophy is all about.